All right, we're on. Um, so I'm submitting this a little late, Bruce. It's a little after noon my time, but I was a little tired last night to get into that after we wrapped up at 10 my time. Um, okay, so some responses. I guess something that really what I learned and what really jumped out at me in the stimulus was a natural thing, but it was just really brought a point to it was how our learned experiences and our own experiences um, bring some variety to the way that we discuss or go about negotiating a resolution. Um, and I think that, again, kind of obvious, but I think more life experience you've had and the more um, jobs or careers that you've had will really influence the way that you can empathize with the other group um, and potentially make you a better negotiator if you've had to be empathetic to others and not only empathetic but also um, are forced to collaborate just in a job site setting where they may not be your friends, but they're people that you can learn to respect and get along with to some degree. Um, Also, made me reflect a little bit this morning on once again this whole program has illustrated this to me quite a bit. Is how different my own life, career life, we'll say, has been, and how unconventional that has been. And I like talking to people that were in my group, like Willow um, and Levita, who are really active teachers and educators and are a part of a big employment structure that will have to have these periodic reviews of their work and things like that. I never really had to engage in any large scale employment negotiations. Kind of often always on the move. If I wasn't working for myself, I was generally working on a job for friends. If I was building an addition on friends' houses, so I'd be living in New York, and then a friend of mine is doing well in the skateboard world and buys property and says, Jack, you're a great guy. Come on out and just stay here for a year and help me build a house or an addition on a house or a big barn to put skateboard ramps in. So, well, yes, I've had a lot of experience too, or a good bit, renovating apartments in New York City or, new bars that were opening, all the gentrification that happened during my time living in Brooklyn. So there were those things too, as I mentioned, another video, but just, of course, you have to deal with architects and designers and other tradespeople. Um, but it's also you could always sort of walk away. Something about being a good carpenter is that for the most part, everyone can always use a carpenter. Um, so it made me realize that I've never really had to um, negotiate in that sense in a really broad speaking way, like we were doing to keep a hospital open, or say to keep a school funded, or what a school is teaching, how they are teaching the subject. I never had to do that. So all right, two, I think what we could have done better is that I think we could have dug deeper a little bit, like you mentioned at the end. Past, I like the structure of past positions and into what are the underlying interests and how that opens up just a much bigger world to start talking about the underlying issues and the emotions that are involved, and also the real life practicalities of these issues. Um, and I feel maybe, I don't mean to be critical, but maybe our stimulation was perhaps a little bit one sided in that our negotiations as the administration, I feel like we could have done could have been more explicit about it, but we did sort of lay out that our bottom line was about the community and about the need for the hospital to stay open and for that community to create good jobs and be a positive role model in the community, and to think more collectively rather than individually. Which again, I've really kind of been focused in the readings on those kind of notions of what is collective and what is individual, and how there's, I guess, always a little bit of that in both competitive and collaborative negotiations. And I think that was maybe highlighted towards the end of our stimulus, when, early at the very end, when this kind of coercive threat was thrown in about the media. That was just sort of unnecessary, and it made, if that was a real life situation, I think it would have made me feel that perhaps there were more holes in the agreement that we had come up with than there appeared to be. So when these coercive things are mentioned, I think people mentioning them should really think about, is this just something that you want to say as an individual, or are you actually getting something out of making this coercive threat? People may want to say something individual, but it's more productive if you find a collective way to say it. So I wanted to segue from this, and I don't want to get too broad, but I enjoyed reading the bit in chapter 9 of your book that talked more globally about individualistic and collective world outlooks. Just kind of paraphrase or roughly quote, but that European and North American societies are regarded as general as having individualistic cultures, emphasizing personal freedom and achievement. Many non-Western societies, in contrast, tend to be collective, according high respect to authority and giving group welfare precedence over individual welfare. Conflicts within individualistic societies tend to be adjudicated within a legal framework based on individual rights, and that framework tends to characterize one side as right and the other as wrong. Conflicts in societies with collective cultures tend to be handled through conciliation to sustain the group affiliation. So, again, I guess I'm going to use last few minutes of just this video to kind of go beyond maybe what's being asked for, or not beyond, but a detour in it. And I'm often saying that this reminds me of philosophy and what I liked about philosophy, but to try to be a little more specific about that, this made me read this whole stimulus, and a lot of the readings made me rethink Nietzsche's whole notion, especially in the second section of the Genealogy of Morals, where he outlines this notion of the creditor-debtor relationship, which is really, I think, an important thing to think about in relation with negotiation, because according to Nietzsche, the whole, and we're going back into ancient times here with Nietzsche, and the beginning of the idea of the creditor-debtor relationship, in that the creditor is good, and the debtor is inherently bad. And you get deeper into Nietzsche, which you probably have at some point in your readings, but this also leads to an analogy for Nietzsche of Christianity and the idea of heaven and hell, sinner and saint. So creditor-debtor runs really pretty deep, and I think I wanted to bring up a couple of these notions that caused me to go back and read a few of my old papers on Nietzsche, and actually the professor that I was visiting that brought me to Turkey, really, he started something called the Nietzsche Circle. I've been on the board of directors of the Nietzsche Circle with him for, I don't know, going on 15 years or something now. So Nietzsche's philosophy and ways to interpret it and modernize it have always been sort of an interest to me. So to dwell on this a little bit, because I think it's worthwhile, is that Nietzsche traces the origin of guilt and consciousness to the primitive relationship between buyer and seller, creditor and debtor. We are creatures who measure and evaluate everything. Everything has a price, deeds just as much as goods. This relationship exists also between people and the community they live in. The community provides shelter, peace, security, and much else besides, placing people in its debt. People who break the laws of their community are not only not repaying their debt, but they are assaulting the creditor. Nietzsche observes that the more powerful a community becomes, the less it needs to punish offenders. If the community is weak, any attack against it is life threatening, and such a threat must be eliminated. A community that is strong enough to resist all sorts of assaults has the luxury of letting offenders go unpunished. Such a society has overcome its demand for strict justice. We give the name mercy to the expression of power in letting an offender go. Nietzsche also identifies willing. This goes to his big notion of the will to power and what is the will that is working on a relationship. And I would again like to make that analysis to the relationship in mediation and negotiation and dialogue. So Nietzsche also identifies willing quite closely with meaning and interpretation. That something is meaningful to us means that some will or force is dominating it. For example, my hurting you might be an act of bullying or an act of self-defense. In the first case, there's a very crude will to power acting, where I harm you for the feeling of power it gives me. In the second case, however, I am acting out of instinct of self-preservation. In both cases, the deed itself may be the same, but the will that drives me to act interprets the deed in very different ways. Wherever we find a meaning or interpretation, there is will acting to give the deed or thing that meaning or interpretation. Justice and the institution of law essentially takes revenge out of the hands of the offended party. If I am robbed, it is justice and not myself that has been injured, and so justice must claim revenge. Thus, Nietzsche suggests the concept of justice can only exist in a society that has established laws that can therefore be transgressed. There is no such thing as justice in itself. So again, I think that would really help in terms of negotiation. Oh, wow, I'm up to 12 minutes already. Okay. So yes, I think coming to a negotiating table as a mediator or as two different parties to understand that there's a will to power in operation there, and that collaborative justice or collaborative negotiation and competitive negotiation both have significant wills to power that are operating on them. And I guess I'm going to run a little high on time here, but I also have been thinking of an old friend of mine who's a famous, his two sons were old skateboard artists and even ex-roommates of mine. And so I met their father, Tony Serra, S-E-R-R-A, Spanish Serra, probably 20 years ago. And he's a famous or infamous criminal rights lawyer in California from the hippie generation. His brother maybe is more famous, Richard Serra, the sculptor, probably one of the best known modern abstract sculptors. I mean, it's not just me. I think Richard Serra, I mean, the whole Guggenheim in Bilbao was basically built around Richard Serra's work. But his brother Tony, just for an example of how justice, there is no justice within itself. Same in the sense of, I guess what I'm trying to say is in negotiation, that there can be a win-win situation, but it's important not to think of it as bad and good or evil and prosperous. So if you don't have any justice except the formulation of justice itself, that's the way that Tony practices his law. So he's mostly made a career. He's now semi-retired, but has a law firm in San Francisco with maybe over 200 employees. And I've been to Tony's houses in La Honda and in Bolinas, and had a lot of really interesting philosophical conversations with him about law and justice. And his very first case was defending two Hells Angels who were guilty of raping a girl up in Bear Creek at a big party, and it was generally known that they were guilty. But Tony was able to get them off, Um, and then he became a very radical lawyer for the Sudanese Liberation Army, for the Black Panthers. Um, so he's a very interesting guy. If you maybe haven't come across him, a quick Google search with Tony Serra would be interesting. But he had told me once, and I wrote this down, that the courtroom is no place for morality, ethics, or even justice. It's a gladiatorial arena, an arena that has long lost any notion of honor in the Homeric sense. So these are constructs, even justice, if you want to go that far with it, like Nietzsche does, and I think that's worthwhile. Um, that these are constructs based on levels of will to power that are operating on them. The same, I think, could be said for negotiations. So sorry for running long and hoping I didn't get too sidetracked there. All right, thanks again for listening.